welcome everybody. We are pleased today to announce the publication of a new policy statement and technical report from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Jeff Goldhagen is co-author of the policy statement and technical report, and he was a founder of the AAP section on international child health and remains a member. He is a professor and chief of the Division of Community and Societal Pediatrics at the University of Florida College of Medicine in Jacksonville. Dr. Julie Linton was a lead author of the AAP policy statement, Detention of Immigrant Children, which was published in 2017 as a member of the Community Pediatrics Executive Committee. She co-chairs the Immigrant Health Special Interest Group for the Academy and is a pediatrician who works with an immigrant population in South Carolina. She has also traveled to the U.S.-Mexican border to observe children who have been detained. Dr. Goldhagen and Dr. Linton will each give some remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Well, thank you for the opportunity of being here, and I'm going to approve, maybe not. Yep. Hey, great. In actuality, the policy statement technical report include discussions about immigrant children, but really our focus across children all around the world. So I began my career in 1980. It's hard to believe it's been that long, working along the killing fields in Cambodia. And at that time, and then after that, moved to work extensively in East Africa. So the experience I've had in addressing issues related to conflicts, armed conflicts with children, go back many years. And I can say, as well as the other co-authors of this technical report and policy statement, all of whom have worked extensively in their careers in conflict zones, that in fact the status of children, the impact of armed conflict in children over the last 40 years has got substantively worse. It certainly hasn't gotten any better. I need to identify and acknowledge my co-author, Sherry Shinoda, who's a pediatrician in California, Aisha Kadir, who's a pediatrician in Denmark, and Shelley Pitterman, who's recently retired from a career with UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. And so we want to thank you today for coming, for demonstrating your particular interest in this. Julie and I had a fair amount of discussion about whether or not to show any slides during this presentation, but we felt it was really important that you not only heard our words but saw the faces of the children and families that are being impacted by armed conflict and separation around the world. And in fact, if we succeed, our words will become their words. So we thought it was really important that the faces of the people impacted are presented to you today. We define in the technical report and in the policy statement that armed conflict is the result of any organized dispute that involves the use of weapons, violence, or force. And violence associated with groups certainly exists all around the world, but it's very important to recognize the fact that we're also talking about the United States, and that it's critically important that we recognize, in particular as the American Academy of Pediatrics, that there is a substantial impact of armed conflict, in particular issues related to gangs, trafficking, narco-traffic, and so on in the United States. So this is not an issue that we can say belongs to the other world. It's critically important that we understand that it belongs to our world. And it results from complex social, economic, political issues that exist all around the world. It's also important that the U.S. public policy is critically and integrally intertwined with conflicts, not just here in the U.S., but internationally. So with this definition in mind, want to start off by recognizing or stating that this issue of the impact of armed conflicts on children is amongst the most profound and perverse issues impacting the health and well-being of children globally. It's profound because in 2015 there were well over 220 different conflicts existing around the world, 43 of which were identified and have been identified as full-out wars. That still leaves multiple others that have not risen to the level of war, but are certainly impacting children significantly. 1 in 10 children, 1 in 10, hundreds of millions of children around the world are living in and being affected by armed conflict. Let me repeat that. 1 out of 10, hundreds of millions of kids around the world are being impacted by armed conflict. Among the 65 million refugees that exist around the world today, almost half are children, and all of those kids are being impacted by multiple issues, not the least of which is psychological trauma. It's perverse, right? It's perverse because children now are not just casual, in quotes, casualties, right? They're now being targeted. They're being targeted in these wars. And ever since the war in the former Yugoslavia, children have been actually targeted in these conflicts. And 90% of casualties in these conflict zones are actually happening in the context of civilians. So it's profound because it's so pervasive and prevalent. It's perverse now because children are being targeted, and in particular, children who are being engaged as combatants. And so the next issue that we really need to address is the profound impact on physical and mental health issues affecting these children. Obviously, the physical effects are pretty clear. These kids are being impacted by blast injuries, there are amputations, there are penetrating head wounds, there's rape, burns, and bullet wounds. I mean, these children are being devastated by these physical effects. And there's also very significant psychological and mental health issues. Majority of these children are affected by depression, post-traumatic stress disorders, chronic traumatic stress disorders, fear, anxiety, and so on. So that we have a public health crisis internationally affecting hundreds of millions of children, both physically and from a mental health perspective. And that's not discussing all the indirect effects of devastating schools, devastating hospitals, devastating playgrounds, which also are being targeted in these conflict zones. So it's a very different world than it was 40 years ago when I began my career. The other perspective that we want to leave with you today is that this is a fundamental and profound violation of children's rights. With these conflict zones, we have an almost complete loss of respect and dignity for these children. The UN has identified five grave human rights violations impacting these children. One of them is the recruitment and use of children as armed combatants, killing and maiming of children, sexual violence against children, attacks against schools or hospitals, abduction of children, and denial of humanitarian access. So, what's the role of pediatrics? What's the role of pediatricians? What's the role of the Academy of Pediatrics? Well, if you go into and read, which we certainly hope you will, the policy statement and technical report, you'll see an entire inventory, a plethora of actions and steps that can be taken by pediatricians as well as by pediatric organizations around the world. We've divided them up into three different categories: domains, clinical, systems, and public policy. From a clinical standpoint, pediatricians in the U.S. and those who are seeing these children as they're resettled need to understand and begin to reframe their practices in the context of a trauma-informed environment. These kids have been impacted significantly by trauma, and the last thing we want to do is re-traumatize them in environments that are supposed to be nurturing and caring. We need to train and train pediatricians to diagnose and manage the mental health issues they're dealing with. We need to train them to provide care in the context of a culturally and linguistically competent environment. And in particular, for those pediatricians who are working in conflict zones and or near conflict zones, we need to prepare them to understand how to work with resettlement agencies, how to work with the systems that exist in those communities, but also how to address issues, physical issues and mental health issues that are so profoundly impacting these children as they move from the conflict zones into environments that are beginning to be safe for them. So there's much that we can do clinically. From a systems approach, we need to train pediatricians here as well as throughout the world, and in particular those that are working in conflict zones, how to work with systems, how to build systems, how to build public health systems, how to rebuild the systems that have been devastated by the impact of trauma. And also, we need expanded research. There is relatively little known and understood about these issues. Three of us now have just completed a systematic review of the impact of trauma conflict zones on kids, and we can tell you that, in fact, very little is known outside the context of mental health. And then, of course, there's policy and advocacy, which perhaps is the most important contribution that we can make, both as individual pediatricians, but also as well as societies. The first is to ground our work and our advocacy in the principles, standards, and norms of child rights. That provides us a context, a framework, a legal standing, and to address these issues. And if you go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you'll see that there are multiple articles within the Convention that speak specifically to children, immigrant children, children being affected by combatants, as combatants, and in these zones. And also Article 9, which really stands in and of itself as an important article for all of us about the separation of children from families. So the first is to ground our work in children's rights, and the second is really to ensure we engage youth. Youth are the ones and the individuals. Article 12 of the Convention speaks directly to youth participation. Article 17 speaks to the rights of children to have information. Several articles prior to 17 speak about the rights of children to associate, and so on and so forth. So we need to ensure genuine youth participation. We need to implement trauma-informed policies. We need to ensure that advocacy includes special protection for children, again, which is defined very specifically in the Convention. We need to ensure that children are protected from landmines and ordinances after the armed conflicts and after they escape into what potentially is supposed to be safe environments, and we need to ensure access to education. So in summary, 10 minutes of time to address, I think is amongst the most important and public health issues impacting children. I urge you to read the technical report and the policy statement. In it, you'll see a significant amount of suggestions as to how we can move forward together to address this issue. If you want to leave you with 4 points, one of which is profound, right? Profound, that this is a profound issue as it relates to hundreds of millions of children around the world, including here in the U.S. It's perverse because we are now living in a world where children are targeted and hundreds of thousands of children are being recruited as combatants. It's permanent, that the physical and mental health issues that are impacting these children are permanent in nature. And our role is all about protection, using the framework of child rights and social justice and equity to protect these children from current issues, current insults, and to ensure that they have optimal outcomes in the future. Again, I want to thank you for being here today, for your genuine interest in this issue, but I'm going to leave you with one quote, which I think distills these issues down to a single quote. It's in the policy statement. Not only do children have the capacity for resilience in the face of seemingly debilitating circumstances, but they are the agents of peace in their own right. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Julie Linton, who's done just amazing work addressing these issues here in the United States and along the border. Julie. You got your own.
I brought extra.
Yeah, because I screwed it up.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm hoping to put this American Academy of Pediatrics statement on armed conflict into context with respect to the ongoing dialogue about children and families who are arriving on our southern border, fleeing armed conflict, and seeking safe haven. Immigrant families, including those who have come seeking protection, are part of the fabric of the United States. The majority of children and families who are arriving on our southern border are fleeing conditions that are not safe for their health or their well-being. As Dr. Goldhagen so eloquently described, children, rather than being exempt from armed conflict, are often a target for this conflict. Many children I have cared for in both North and South Carolina have been threatened by gangs on their route to school, the primary work of childhood. Instead of continuing to go to school, they stop. The father of one little girl I take care of told me that in her country of origin, the gang members told this dad that they would rape his daughter and kill her if she did not date the leader of the gang. He chose to protect his daughter and flee to seek safety. Armed conflict is a form of toxic stress. As children are developing, their brains are responding to their environment and their experiences. Serious prolonged stress, known as toxic stress, can harm the short and long-term health of children and families. Armed conflict, as well as the conditions that families face after fleeing this armed conflict, including family separation and detention, are forms of toxic stress. In the short term, we may see changes in their bodily functions, their ability to sleep, to eat, and urination and stooling. We may see changes in their behavior, numbing, profound fear of separation from a parent, aggression. And we may see changes in their ability to learn and in their development. Immediate outcomes that we've seen from studies looking at the impact of toxic stress show things like higher rates of preterm births or low birth weight babies. In the long run, we know that toxic stress in the form of adverse childhood experiences places children as adults at risk for conditions like diabetes, depression, heart disease, and high blood pressure. Instead of detention, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends releasing children and their families into the community while their immigration cases proceed. This would end detention and would end the process of placing ankle monitors on parents who are seeking safety for their children. Families should not be separated, and this includes adults, siblings, parents, and other family members. However, our current system actually punishes children and their families for seeking safe haven by subjecting them to detention and potential separation. After fleeing their countries of origin in a harrowing journey to arrive here, children and families are subject to processing, potential separation, and detention in facilities that threaten their health. Separation and detention are re-traumatizing and further threaten the health and well-being of children who have already been exposed to armed conflict and toxic stress. For instance, the conditions in the processing centers, which I have witnessed myself, include things such as chain link fences that extend from the floor to the ceiling, lights that are kept on 24/7, and children lying on the floor in Mylar blankets that crinkle into the echo chamber of a warehouse. One young man I take care of witnessed the murder of his mother by a gang. He was subsequently shot by the gang members in retaliation for witnessing this crime. He then fled his country of origin to seek protection, and he has subsequently suffered both physical and mental repercussions after these trauma, which were further exacerbated by prolonged detention for 9 months. Currently, more than 75% of the families that are held in family residential settings would pass their credible fear or reasonable fear interviews, meaning that they have a right by international law and by our laws here in this country to have their cases heard for safety. Armed conflict is not just a global issue or a border issue. It impacts the health of communities across the United States. Ongoing trauma in communities made worse by limited access to critical services, criminalizing rhetoric, fear and uncertainty instilled by policies can make healing difficult. There are crucial steps that all of us can take within our own communities to begin to support children who have fled armed conflict in beginning the healing process. We can build access to trauma-informed health care by accessing our clinics, public health departments, federally qualified health centers, and hospital sponsorship programs. We can support children as they enter the school system to do the work of the child, which is to learn, grow, and develop. We can facilitate access to mental health care and dental health. And perhaps most importantly, we can create partnerships that support access to legal representation so that no child ever has to go to court alone while their case is being heard. In summary, armed conflict is a form of toxic stress and a social determinant that threatens the health and well-being of children and families across the globe during their journeys towards safe haven and within communities across the United States. As a pediatrician, I stand with the American Academy of Pediatrics in supporting every child in seeking optimal health and a safe and hopeful future. Thank you.
You're part of the discussion here. Was it focusing on it was not so much focusing on the guidelines. It was your experience, but they weren't necessarily the guidelines. That's correct.
So armed conflict includes gang violence, and so a lot of the conversation now is addressing the impact of flight of children from that violence in search of safe haven, and so we were putting the policy that has been written into the context of current events that are happening here in the United States.
Is there any, do you have any idea of how your words are being received now, especially with the rhetoric that's being ramped up, the caravans coming, so they're sending troops to the border? Are your words getting through?
I'll start with that, and then Dr. Goldhagen may have additional answers. All I can say is that I hope that we can begin to change the narrative of a caravan towards understanding that caravan is filled with children and families who are fleeing the very armed conflict that is described in this policy statement towards seeking safety, to which they have an international right to ask for when they appear at our borders.
Yeah, my comment is that we're experiencing this particular issue at a point in time, right? And as I began my presentation, things have gotten worse over the last 40 years. as it relates to the impact of armed conflict on children. So not only are we seeing increased numbers of children, we're seeing increased numbers of children now coming to the borders. We're seeing the effects of armed combatants, turning children into armed combatants. These are global issues. The United States has not had a significant enough voice. We're the only country in the world that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have, however, ratified the optional protocol on the impact of creating children as armed combatants. And so we're focused now on the voice of what's happening now along the borders. But it's a much larger global issue, and that's why this technical report and policy statement are so critical, because the voice of the Academy up until now, as it relates to policy, has not been as loud and as important as it needs to be. And so I commend the Academy for making this step, taking this step to establish this technical report and policy statement as it relates to the global issues impacting these children and families. And for every child that comes to the border, right, there are thousands and thousands and thousands that are not at the border, both in Central South America as well as globally. And if we could focus on what's happening at the border and then expand it globally, we'll have a significant impact on the health and well-being of kids.
So, Jeff and Judy, I noticed here that the recommendations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the short sheet that you have here. And I've been doing something unusual in the last 8 years, which is getting involved in the community on preventive health, lifestyle. And why am I mentioning it? Because right now we're reacting to a situation. We are reacting to a situation. Is there anything we can do as far as prevention specifically, that these situations that arise that now we're reacting to? Maybe we can make some recommendations on how we can prevent something specific.
Prevent things in the U.S. or prevent things
Prevent
globally?
what's happening at the border, for example.
Well, I think we can probably answer that both as a United States context and in a global context, so I'll take United States and share global with you. So we need comprehensive immigration reform that incorporates policy that prioritizes children throughout the entire immigration system, that includes pathways to citizenship for families who have been here and are part of our fabric of our society, for DACA youth, and a fair system when people arrive on our border. And through fair, comprehensive immigration policies such as that's been advocated for by the American Academy of Pediatrics, that is focused on children and families, I think we can begin to address some of the crises that we're seeing at the border through a policy that is representative of international law and of what we know to be best for the health and well-being of children.
Yeah, so I would second that for sure. And then with respect to kids in the U.S., actually look at what's happening in our own communities. And Julie had mentioned a number of issues, but the care of these children has become almost a specialty in the context of community pediatrics and the medical homes, the medical behavioral health homes that are required to address trauma, create trauma-informed care, work with resettlement agencies. We know that one of the critical issues related to resilience actually in children is the status of their parents, so we need to be addressing the mental health issues of their parents, certainly family separation for sure, creating a rights-respecting environment that allows these young people to associate, to hear their voice, to listen to their voice. So there is much that we can do on the local level as we receive these children and families to really maximize the resilience that these children have. And then, if you go to the technical report, you'll see lots and policy statement, you'll see lots of examples of how we can, in fact, mitigate what's happening globally for these children. And one of the misperceptions is that when we take a look at the 65 million refugees, we immediately think that these are individuals, children, and families that are crossing borders. The great majority of these kids are internally displaced, right? They're internally displaced. They're not making it across borders. The majority of children and families in Syria, as an example, have not made it outside of Syria, but are internally displaced within Syria. So advocacy for what happens within countries through international organizations and so on is critically important as well. So if you go through the technical report and policy statement, you'll see a number of suggested interventions that can happen, can be implemented in order to not only prevent, which is primary prevention, but also secondary and tertiary prevention through treatment and rehabilitation. But I think it's really important to understand that children are resilient, and they do have a future if we provide them a rights-respecting environment that can ensure equity as they grow older.